Hi, my name is Freya Smith and I am a speech and language therapist in Sandwell.
Hi, my name's Jenna and I'm a speech and language therapist in Sandwell as well.
So we've just put together a bit of a presentation about what speech, language and communication is, and we're going to go over some of the areas of what we're going to cover in this presentation. So some of the things that we're going to cover in today's training are we're going to go through what speech and language therapy is and what speech and language therapists do. We've got some slides around statistics, and these statistics relate to speech, language and communication needs, education and employment. We're going to have a look at how speech, language and communication needs can impact a student in the classroom. We're going to give you some general strategies to use. We're going to think about some key areas of need within secondary age children and some strategies you can use with these. We are also going to cover a little bit about developmental language disorder as well, what this is. This is also known as DLD. And then at the end of the PowerPoint, we'll signpost you to some useful resources and places that you can go to look for further information. So when we think about what speech and language therapy is and what speech and language therapists look at, it's a whole wide range of things really. Lots of people think that it's just speech or stammering, but it's actually a lot more than this. So we have a look at how students understand language. So this can include problem solving, how they understand different levels of questions, such as who, what, where, why kind of questions. We have a look at how they infer meaning from different questions. We look at their memory and their vocabulary skills. We also look at how students use language, so how they put words into sentences, how they make their sentences, how they might be able to tell a story. We cover social interaction as well. So social interaction looks at maintaining friendships, it looks at emotions, it looks at social cues, facial language, facial expressions, body language, things like that, and just how people generally interact with each other. Speech sound production, so how the sounds are made. We also look at attention and listening, and we cover specific areas as well. So stammering is something that lots of people know speech and language for, but also things like selective mutism. So when a young person may be able to talk okay in one environment, but actually in other environments that's really increasing their anxiety levels and they can't talk in those places. We do some work with hearing impairment, if it's impacting on the speech production, and sometimes we also do look at voice as well. Just as a bit of advice, we don't in Sandwell cover dyslexia or dyscalculia, and that's something that we'd advise schools. If we're talking to parents, we would advise them to talk to schools about that, as we do not cover that area in speech and language therapy. So we're going to talk through some statistics for you. So if we're having to think about educational achievement, vocabulary at 5 is a powerful predictor of GCSE achievements. Also, if we're looking at behaviour and vulnerability, so 2/3 of 7 to 14-year-olds with serious behaviour problems have a language impairment, which is obviously quite a large number. Also impacts on mental health. So 40% of 7 to 14-year-olds referred to child psychiatric services had a language impairment that had never even been suspected. Impacts on employability too. So 47% of employers say they can't get recruits with the communication skills they need. If you're thinking a bit about criminality, so like youth offending service and things like that, 65% of young people in young offender institutes have communication difficulties. And then just a little bit about the disadvantage cycle too. So children from low income families lag behind high income counterparts by 16 months in vocabulary at school entry. And we've just got another slide, so just continuing with some more statistics. So 10% of children and young people within the general population have some level of speech, language, communication need. This increases to 60% in areas of social deprivation. So we do a lot of work in Sandwell and we see these higher numbers as well. 81% of children and young people with social, emotional, mental health needs will also have communication difficulty. But it's key to kind of note that actually only 12% are assessed 12% that are assessed look at speech, language and communication needs. And then our last page we've got on statistics. So children with SEN are 7 times more likely to be excluded than their peers. Only 22% of children with SEN achieve their expected grades in reading, writing and maths. And children or young people with poor vocabulary skills are twice as likely to be unemployed. So I think those are some really key statistics there about how speech and language can really impact on education, employment and our young people in the future as well. So on this slide we've got a bit of a visual picture about how speech, language and communication needs can impact a young person in the classroom. So if we're thinking about when we work with children that have got speech and language communication needs, they might have difficulties with higher level languaging. So this is like inferring meaning from text or inferring meaning from a picture. They might have difficulties with their working memory. They might have poor expressive language skills, which means if you ask them a question, they might not be able to properly answer it. They might give you maybe a strange or odd response that doesn't make sense. They might be missing out those kind of key grammar words. They may have vocabulary difficulties when they're speaking or putting their hand up, or within their writing as well. They might find social situations difficult. So even being within the classroom, that might be a difficult situation. They might find it hard to work or be around other people. They might have a poor understanding of time concepts as well. So these students may not come to your lessons on time. They might not realise when the lessons have ended or when they're starting. They might find it hard to get around school or even to arrive at school on time. Or even in lessons, if you set a task for and say so it's got to be completed within 5 minutes, they may not have a concept of how long 5 minutes is or how long they've got for that task. They may have difficulty sequencing or kind of just following those instructions that you give them within the lesson as well. So we just wanted to provide you with some general classroom strategies that we tend to put within all our speech and language reports that we advise any staff within classrooms to kind of follow these strategies really. So just making sure that when you are doing or giving instructions, you're breaking it down into smaller, more manageable chunks. So rather than reading a sentence that's got loads of complex information in and is going to be really hard to remember, break that down for them and make it visual, put it on the board for them so that they can see it. Allow that young person extra time to think of an answer. Sometimes our young people need that time to process what's being said. So just count to 10 in your head, and you know the silence might feel a bit uncomfortable at the time, but that's allowing them to process what the question was, think about an answer and give a response. Make sure that you're just repeating instructions as well when needed. So if you've said something and given an instruction, just say it again so people have heard you and they've heard you repeating what you've said. We always say about checking the student's understanding, because if you turn around to a student and say, do you understand? A lot of the time they're going to say to you, yeah, even if they don't understand. So check that student's understanding by getting them to repeat the instruction back to you. So it could be that, what have I just said? What have you got to do for this task? And seeing how well they can kind of explain that to you. And that will give you some idea of how well they've understood that activity or what they've got to do. When we're thinking about attention listening, just make sure you say the young person's name before you're giving an instruction so they know that you're speaking to them, and make sure you've got their full attention before even trying to give them instructions. So if they're looking around the classroom, they're not even facing you, there's no point giving them an instruction, they're not going to follow it or listen to it. So make sure that you've said their name, they're looking in your direction, and then give them that instruction. A bit more about kind of attention and concentration as well. Allow time for kind of small breaks. So if it's a really heavy lesson as well and there's a lot of information, allow them time away just to look away from the slides or information, have those small brain breaks, and if they need to get up and stretch their leg and move around the classroom, that's fine. Give them a couple of minutes to reset their attention. And then just around the classroom, have visuals wherever possible. So this could be having symbols and pictures to support what's being said, having some paper out with the instructions in front of them, just so they've got visuals there to support their understanding as well.
So now we're going to spend some time going through the key areas of difficulty that we see most often with secondary aged pupils, as well as some strategies that you can use to support those specific areas of need. They can be used in the classroom, either for that specific child or as a whole class, or they can be used in separate learning time if the child's being taken out of class. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is concentration. This is something we find young people struggle with all the time. And when we have chats with young people, it's often something that they say themselves. They find it really hard to concentrate or pay attention in class. So concentration effectively is just the young person's ability to focus on a task, listen to the teacher, and carry out any work that has been asked of them. So it's important in lesson because you need to be able to take in and understand the right information so that you know what you've got to do and how long you've got to do the tasks. And if you're not concentrating, then you're not going to remember all of that information. And if you've not remembered all of that information, then you're going to have difficulty completing tasks independently and within the set times. You often find that they may ask other students or they may ask teachers a lot for repetitions because they've just not remembered what you've asked them to do. And then concentration generally in the classroom can be impacted on by lots of things. It can be the noise level. Even if you think it's a relatively quiet for a classroom environment, there may be some people that find any tiniest of little noises distracting. And it could also just be the number of pupils in there and who they're sat with. So if they're sat with a group of peers that they get on really well with, then they might chat more in class, which is going to have an impact on their concentration. So there are some strategies that we can use to support concentration, and one of those is task plans. So task plans are a visual way of showing the child or young person what they're expected to do during a lesson or an activity. They can be modified completely for each child, so they can be really simple in that they don't have much information on, or they can be more detailed and have writing and pictures on. It completely depends what that young person needs. And the task plans are just there either on the table in front of the student, or you can have it on a whiteboard for the whole class to look at, and it just lets them know what they're expected to complete during the lesson, and it also helps to improve their independence in carrying out tasks, because where they would normally be asking you or a peer for support in what they need to do, they can just look at the piece of paper that's in front of them and know what they've got to do next. So on this slide, we've got a couple of examples of a task plan. So there's a more simplified version and then there's a more in-depth version. So the simplified version on the left covers a maths lesson, and that's just got written down the bigger chunks of the lesson that the child will need to remember. So the very first thing they need to do is write their name and date on the piece of paper, and then they've got to complete a task, answer some questions in a book, listen to the teacher, and then write down their homework. Whereas the task plan on the right of the screen is much more detailed. So it has at the top what they've got to do, the task that they've got to complete. Then it's got a list of all the different things that they might need for that task. And then it's got a section that looks at what they need to do, and that's quite detailed. And then after that, there's a section about what might happen next. And then there's also a visual reminder at the bottom of that one about the start time and the end time of the lesson. So while there's two examples on this page, you can kind of create your own one with as much detail as you need. You might only need simple information like the one on the left, but you might think that they would benefit from some visual support as well, so you can add that in. So another area we find secondary age pupils struggle with a lot is vocabulary. So often they find it hard to think of the word that they're wanting to say. It may be that they know the word, they just can't get it from their brain out of their mouth. Or it might be they have no idea what that word is. And vocabulary can impact both on the child's communication with other people as well as their understanding of what other people have said to them. If they don't have any recollection of what the words the other people have said means, then they're not going to understand what you've asked them to do. And vocab generally for everybody is really tricky because there's lots of words for us to use and there's lots of different words that all mean the same thing, so it can be a tricky thing for children to get their head around. And we find specifically those that have speech language communication needs or developmental language disorder have often missed big chunks in school for various reasons, anxiety because they're behind their peers or they're just not understanding what's going on. So this can increase gaps in their vocabulary, which then makes it even harder for them to know what the words mean. You might also find that people who have difficulties with literacy skills may miss out on the opportunity to learn new words because they may not be reading as much, or if they are reading, they're maybe not understanding what they've read, so they then can't store that new word in their brain for future use. So there are ways that we can support vocabulary, and the biggest one we tend to use is word webs. So word webs are used to help learn, store and use spoken and written vocabulary. They use specific questions to talk about the word, which helps the young person to fully understand the word and store it in their brain for use later on. When you're doing word webs, you should be using a combination of words and colours, because this makes it easier for the child or young person to remember the word, because if they've not quite understood the words on the word web, then they've got colours and pictures to refer back to. And word webs are really easily transferable from single words all the way up to whole topic learning in class. So word webs effectively look just like a spider diagram. There's a word in the middle and then there's little legs coming off it that cover different things. So if we have a look at one that could be used for a specific word, it might look something like this. So the bits we've got on the blue in the top corner are the sound elements of the word. So it's what's the first sound, what's the last sound, how many syllables are there in the word, and some words that it could rhyme with. And then the green boxes are all about the meaning. So these are all prompts to help the child to remember what the word means. So it's things like where you might find the item, the category it belongs to. They might want to draw a picture or use the word in a story. They might want to think of a word that means the opposite, or they might want to try and think of a word that has a similar meaning, and that might be a word that they already have in their vocabulary, that they already know. And when you're doing word webs, ideally they should be stored somewhere where the child or young person can access them on their own. So if they hear that word again, if they can't quite remember what it means, they know they've got a folder or a place in the classroom they can go to find the word web that relates to that specific word, and it just helps them to remember what it is. And then we've also got here an example of how a word web can be used for a whole topic. So this is looking at Shakespeare's Hamlet. So the main legs off the middle are all different areas or aspects of that. So you've got the characters that are in it, the themes that are in it, interpretations, the scenes that are in it, as well as soliloquies that are in the story. And then you've got little branches off the big branches that separate out into the individual aspects of each of those bigger areas. And again, these ones are ones that can be done as a whole class, or they're ones that can be done one-to-one, or even in small groups. If you've got a small group of kids in the class that you know are going to really struggle to understand the topic or certain aspects of the topic, then you could always separate them off into smaller groups and they could do some work like this while the other children carry on with other things. Okay, so the next bit we're going to look at is narrative. And this is a really important skill to have, as it helps us to make sense of the world and build on our understanding of ourselves. It's also a really important skill to have for mental health, as it allows the child or young person to talk about their own lives and the things that have happened to them. But it is typically something that children and young people with speech, language and communication needs find challenging. They often struggle to structure their sentences or stories properly, or they may struggle with including all the important bits of information. So they might tell you who was there and what happened, but not where it happened or why it happened, which can make it really hard for the listener to understand what's going on. And again, they may also not have the vocabulary they need to tell their story, so that could be a big hindrance in them being able to include all the information that they need. So there are some things you can do to help. So again, one of the main things we tend to give advice for is narrative grids. And these are a visual aid tool that help the students get their point across. And it helps them to sequence the structure of their story, as well as helps the listener to gather information from them if there's bits that they've missed out. Using the visual also helps the child to kind of remember what they need to include in their story, and it can almost act as a bit of a prompt to help them to produce a story that's more easy to understand. So this is an example of a narrative grid. Again, they come in many shapes and forms. Some of them are more detailed, some of them are simpler, but this is sort of a very generic one that has 6 boxes. So the idea is you go through with the child or young person and get them to fill in each of the boxes as they tell the story. And these are all the important pieces of information you need in the story to be able to understand what's going on. So you need to know who's in the story, where the story happened, when it happened, what happened, potentially maybe what happened next if you think they can kind of provide that level of information, as well as the end or the resolution to the story. You might find that when they first start using these, they need lots of support. So you might have to actually physically sit down with them and run through each of the boxes and fill them in and then get them to tell the story. Or it might just be that they can have that piece of paper in front of them on the desk and they just look down to remember the bits of information that they need. So the next area we're going to look at is problem solving. And this is a key part of development because we need to learn how to manage relationships with peers, school staff, parents, and anybody else we might meet. And that's often something that the children and young people we see find really tricky. Once children have left the early years, interactions become more verbal. So once they're at school, they're often expected to talk more. And this is something that children with speech, language and communication needs can find hard because they may struggle to put a story together, they may not be able to think of the words that they want to say, and sometimes as well they may not be able to attend for the full length of the conversation, so they again might be missing chunks of things that are said. If someone can use words well, then they're able to problem solve. But if they struggle to use their words, then that's typically when we find that they have more difficulty in solving problems. So to be able to successfully solve a problem, a young person needs to be able to understand what's been said, have some kind of knowledge around emotions and how other people might have been feeling, as well as explain their own feelings during that situation. So the strategy we tend to suggest for this is comic strip conversations. So these help young people to understand and reflect on a situation in a visual way. They help to solve conflicts in a non-confrontational way. So these are usually completed once the young person has calmed down, so there's no emotion related to it anymore. They're not in the fight or flight response, so they're not going to start kicking off again. And it's usually done separately. So the people that were involved in the situation initially aren't together when this is done. It gives the child or young person a way to communicate their points of view. It helps them to understand what others might have been thinking or feeling. It helps them to predict what might happen next, and it can also help to improve their problem solving skills because it gives them clear step-by-step visuals on what happened, where it went wrong, and what they can do to fix it. So they can be quite a challenging thing to put together, but this is kind of a brief guide on how to put together. So the first thing you need to do with the young person is choose a colour to represent each different emotion, because you're going to use those when you're putting the comic strip together to show how each person was feeling. There's no right or wrong colour that should be used for any emotion. It's purely down to what the young person would like to use for that comic strip. Once you've decided that, you need to then go on to actually creating the comic strip story itself. So the information you need to include is where the incident happened, who was there, what was said, the young person's thoughts on the conversation that was had and what was said, how the young person thought the other person might have felt or what they were thinking during the incident, how the young person thought what they said or what they did made the other person feel, and then at the end you also need to plan a resolution. So this is an example of a comic strip conversation about somebody forgetting personal space. So things were said from the boy to the girl. He got a little bit too close, she got upset, and then he was worried about what had happened. So you can see here there's red, blue and yellow. So they all indicate the different feelings the people were having when they were thinking the things that they were thinking. And then this is an example for the same situation of how that incident could be resolved. So again, you've got different colours this time because they're typically happier. Nobody's crying in it as they were in the previous one, and this just helps the young person to be able to see what they could do if that situation would happen again. Now you might find while they're really easily able to recount the story as it happened, you may need to give them more support in thinking of a resolution, because that might be something they find harder. They might have one go-to response for each situation, which can make it hard for them to think of ways that they could solve it in the future. And again, similar to the word webs, these comic strip conversations can be kept. So if a similar situation happens again, you can get them out with the young person, and rather than having to do a new one each time, you can just go over the one that you've done and just kind of remind them about what was said when you put it together in the first place. So lots of the strategies we've spoken about in this presentation are very visual. So there's pictures to go alongside it, or there's bits of paper on the pupils' table to help them to remember what they've got to do. So we thought it would be a good idea just to kind of go over some reasons as to why visuals are helpful. So they're more permanent. So once it's down in front of them, or it's on a piece of paper, or it's on a whiteboard, it's there until it gets taken away. Whereas when you're talking to them, once you've said it, it's gone. So if they can't remember it, then that's it. They've got no way of getting that back unless they ask you to repeat it. They allow the young person time to process the language that they've used, because again, it's there, it's permanent. They can look at it and refer back to it as often as they need to, and they can take as long as they need to process the information that's on there, because again, it's not gone once you've finished saying it. They can help prepare students to prepare for transitions. So you might use a now next board to help those that really need lots of support in knowing what's coming next. You might have, like what was on the task plan, a clock for them to be able to see how long they've got for each task, or the length of the lesson. It can help them to see what you mean. So sometimes if they've got vocabulary difficulties, they may not be able to remember what the word you said means, but if you've drawn a picture, then that can help them visualize it. And they're good for all students. These are things you can be using in class with all your students. They don't have to be children that have speech, language and communication difficulties. They will help everybody. Like we said before, it can help them to build independence because they're not relying on staff as much. And they're also transferable between different environments and people. So it doesn't matter if you've got a word web that you've done with them and they think they need it in a different class, then they can use it. It's going to be the same. It's consistent. Whereas if they have a different teacher, they might explain things differently to how you said it to them, and that can cause confusions. Visuals aren't people, so they don't have an attitude, so there's no tone of voice related to it. There's no disapproving looks or no frustration coming from tone of voice, so the pupil's not kind of interpreting what's been said or the way it's been said as a bad thing. They are what they are. There's no sort of interpretation to them. And then they can also really help to reduce anxiety, because the student will know what's coming next, they'll know what they're expected to do, so they're not constantly thinking about, or what happens if I forget, or what happens if I'm late to my next lesson, because that information is there for them in front of them.
So as we previously mentioned kind of earlier on in the presentation, we said we were going to speak about developmental language disorder a little bit, and we can send out some extra information around this as well. So in terms of developmental language disorder, it is quite a new term. You might not have heard of it, or you might have heard of something called specific language impairment, so SLI, previous kind of DLD. So developmental language disorder is used to describe when a child or young person whose language skills are significantly lower than expected for their age. And when a child's got DLD, we aren't really expecting them to make progress independently. And these difficulties can be of understanding how they use language, their narrative. It might be kind of with a specific area, it might be with all of those areas, but it's where they're kind of significantly behind with those as well. It's important to note that developmental language disorder is just kind of a standalone diagnosis. So if you've got a young person or a student that's maybe got autism or learning disabilities or something like that, those students can still have a language disorder, but we would say it's a language disorder associated with autism. They can't have DLD and autism. And developmental language disorder is a lifelong condition. So it often affects 2 children on average in every classroom as well. So on here are just a few websites that you can have a look at or use to access support. Some of it's around more specific stuff. So like I was just talking about, there is the DLD and Me website, and that talks about developmental language disorder. It tells you more detail what it is. There's some videos on there. So that whole website's kind of dedicated to DLD. So you can have a look at that. There's also SMERA as well. So this is the selective mutism website. This provides you a bit more information about what selective mutism is, how you can support, how it might look. It tells you a little bit about what selective mutism is and what it isn't as well. You've also got Stammer, which is a website around stammering. Again, there's lots of information about stammering. They've got some stuff on there about people who have got a stammer, and they talk about their experiences. They tell you about what stammering is, different programs out there that might help. And then you've also got the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists website. So this has got lots of fact sheets on all the different areas that we cover really, or different diagnoses that we give out. So like things around kind of stammering stuff is on there, speech sound stuff is on there as well. There's a whole list of things that you can look at, but you can also look at a bit of the research behind it as well, if needed. So those are just a few websites that you can access to get more information, but you can also look at pages like Twitter feeds and Facebook. They've often got links on all these websites to stuff about that as well.
And here we've just got a few resources that might be useful to support with secondary speech, language and communication. So the one at the top is Language for Behaviour and Emotions. This is a relatively new resource, but it covers lots of different things. It looks at emotions, problem solving, storytelling, all sorts of different things. And we can send across some copies of pages out of this resource just to give you an idea of what it covers. There's some narrative grids in there that are slightly more detailed than the ones we've shown you. So it will just give you a bit of a flavour of what it talks about and what it focuses on. Then there's secondary language builders, which again kind of focuses on helping the young people to build up their language skills. Talk about for teenagers, that focuses more on the social side, so it looks a lot at kind of friendships and social relationships and how you can be kind of assertive in a situation as opposed to aggressive and things like that. And then there's also zones of regulation, which is based around emotions. So it's again a visual resource that uses colours to depict different zones of emotions in a young person. So it might be calm, agitated, angry, things like that. And again, it just gives them that visual representation for how they're feeling. And again, we can send around some kind of cutouts and handouts from that book to give you an idea of the kind of things it covers. So that is the end of this presentation. On here, you've just got mine and Freya's email addresses. So if you have any questions about anything that we've covered in the presentation, or you want to know more information about anything that we've spoken about, then you can drop us an email. Our working days are on that page as well, so you can email any day of the week, but we may not get back to you if it's not one of our working days. We will also, along with the presentation, send some handouts on some of the things we've covered in the presentation, just to give you a little bit more information about what they are. So thank you for listening, and we're around over all of the schools, so feel free to grab us if you see us in school and ask us some questions.